Welcome back to CivilNet. I'm joined today by former parliamentarian and now political analyst Mikayel Zolyan. Mikayel, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation.
Let's start from the beginning. What is going on? What is going on from Armenia geopolitically speaking? We're on the one hand claiming that we're going to be changing our political orientation, and on the other, I would say the Armenian public is waiting for a specific step in that direction. I mean, we haven't left the CSTO. We're not leaving that god-awful Eurasian Economic Union. We're still in bondage toward Russia. So give us the overall context of Armenian Russian relations and our role in this region.
Well, that's a complicated question, and I wish I knew, for sure what's going on. But from what I see, and from what I hear, I can make some conclusions. And what is going on, I think, is the following: Armenia is trying to become an independent country, which, of course, it's been independent since 1991, but in reality, it is in a sort of neo-colonial or post-colonial dependence from Russia. So, if you take security, that's obvious. If you take economy, that's obvious. If you take media, if you take
energy,
energy, obviously. Yeah. Also, there's an ideological dependence still, that the narratives that are produced by Russian propaganda or by Russian elites, they're still being consumed by Armenian society, and many people in Armenia, they see the world through sort of the lenses of Russian propaganda or ideology or whatever you call it. So now Armenia is it has to become independent, because otherwise staying with Russia, it means that we will be sold out to Turkey and Azerbaijan, basically.
Well, we were already.
And we were, so that's what happened in Artsakh. And now, if we continue being a Russian ally, it means that we will have to give the so-called Zangezur corridor to Azerbaijan and Turkey. So even if, somebody said that, okay, it's okay to be a sort of like semi-independent state as long as it gives us security, well, it doesn't give us security, just the opposite. It actually makes the security situation worse. Yeah. So we have to get rid of Russia in this sense, obviously. Yeah. But the problem is that because we're so dependent on Russia, we cannot do it at once. So because there is so much dependence, I think Armenian government is trying to do it step by step. It's trying to go this road, with small sections. So, of course, the Prime Minister's visit to Brussels and the speech, it was a big step. Yeah. But obviously, you can't expect too much. I mean, of course, it would be great if you went there and said, we're leaving the CSTO, we're leaving the Eurasian Economic Union, and we want to be part of European Union and maybe part of NATO. But we understand it doesn't work that way, because if Russia wants to shut down Armenia's economy in one day, it can. Yeah. It's very unfortunate, but that's the reality. So we have to deal with this reality.
Yeah, I hate using this example, but the truth is that our relationship to Russia has been that of pretty much the battered spouse that can't seem to get away, right? Is that when you finally say, okay, I'm leaving, you're getting like a 3 a.m. Facebook message. Who's liking your photos? It's like we have the French coming to visit. Zakharova right away is complaining, despite the fact that we've received nothing but abuse from them, right? And we've literally our taxpayer dollars, right? Like we paid hundreds of millions of dollars for weapon systems to defend us that has not arrived, right? And this was before the Ukraine conflict. I do remember there was an interesting WikiLeaks from 2012, where the United States was warning us, you're going to lose another war. You guys need to do this. And one of the generals that they spoke to responded that Russia is deliberately keeping us weak. 2012. This is not news. It's just becoming public knowledge now, right? But I did find the Prime Minister's speech quite interesting. It was in Strasbourg, by the way, not Brussels. But it's easily confused. But he mentioned it's very interesting because he deliberately called out Russia. This was almost, I would say, one of the first specific criticisms of Russia at that scale right, to parliamentarians. What do you make of this? And more specifically, do you think there's going to be a reckoning coming soon? There's going to be some kind of punishment for this behavior?
Well, I think that's a very good analogy, and it also explains, this kind of abusive partner analogy. It also explains why it's so hard to get rid of this domination, and also it explains why the signs which were very obvious, what you mentioned, WikiLeaks, I talked to political analysts, I talked to politicians, and they were saying this, that, Russia is going to sell you out. But it was very difficult for the majority of Armenians, including myself, to believe that, not because it was something which would seem unrealistic, but because we were trained, we were brainwashed, I would even say, by not just during the last years, but for hundreds of years, that Russia is our big brother, it's our best friend, it's this is the country which has saved us so many times, and it's psychologically very difficult to put this aside. And unfortunately, the majority of Armenian society needed a huge shock like the 2020 war or like the recent ethnic cleansing of Artsakh to finally, get to understand that, to come to terms with it.
Yeah.
I think the speech in Strasbourg, it was important because we finally, and there were a few interviews like that in the past, in the recent weeks and months, when finally the prime minister started, saying things which basically saying as it is.
Yeah.
There were a couple before that. He was trying to give the message. There was some leaks. There was this article in Հայկական ժամանակ, which everyone knows is the prime minister's related, newspaper, and there was an article which was written by somebody called a reliable source, and sort of everybody understood what that meant, but still it wasn't an official saying that. So I think this is a very important step. And what is Russia going to do? I already saw some news that some Russian member of parliament is saying that Armenian cognac is not as good as they say it is, and maybe we should do something about it. So I'm sure there will be something. The question is how.
Russians would literally drink motor oil. They're not particularly selective.
I kind of agree with this guy, because when you go to Russia and you see what they call Armenian cognac, there are some brands which I never knew they exist. It's like they just look at the map of Armenia and they pick a random village and they name a cognac after that, and maybe a lot of this cognac is actually made in Dagestan or somewhere else in southern Russia, but that's not the question. We all understand that this is political. Somehow just now they discover that not all Armenian cognac is of high quality, and by the way, the Ararat cognac is not anymore provided to Russia because it's owned by Pernod Ricard and it doesn't work in Russia anymore. So anyway, Russia will do something. It cannot afford not to do anything. So they have to react somehow, because otherwise they will, the rest of the Russian allies, they also are not very happy about the situation. So if they see that Armenia is doing this and there are no consequences, then they may be tempted to, do something like that too. But also I think Russia would be, if they act rationally, I don't think they would do two strong measures all at once, because then they basically cut off Armenia and then they lose any hope of kind of gaining it back. So in my view, which is probably a bit idealistic and probably it's not going to happen, but the best thing would be to have a sort of normal, grown-up, serious conversation with the Russians and say, look, security, you understand it's not working anymore, we need to go somewhere else. In terms of economy, there are things which are good for both of us. Let's go on. Let's continue this cooperation. Tourism, great. You need to fly to Europe because you don't have flights anymore. Of course, you're using, Istanbul or whatever, but you can use Yerevan, and which a lot of Russians are doing this, So the best option would be not to have when I'm saying Armenia has to become independent, it doesn't mean we need to become enemies with Russia. That would be really an unfortunate turn of events if we become enemies with Russia. So we have to defend our independence, but it doesn't mean we need to become an enemy of Russia. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's how Moscow sees it. I think for a lot of people in Moscow, you're either with them or against them.
What do you make of the, I would say, the counter argument that this government has been provoking Russia, and what we're seeing as a response to it? in other words, is it clear from what we know that this is the case, or is it vice versa? Is it that the PM is responding to a lot of the failures on the Russian side? I mean, we can even go back to, on the one hand, after 2018, I know the government went out of their way to show that they're still loyal to Russia, but on the other hand, they wanted to arrest Khachaturov. So they had some moves that may have upset the Kremlin. What's your take on that?
Well, I think there are several reasons why this argument appeared. One is this analogy that you mentioned with an abusive partner, and for an abusive partner, whatever the other partner does, they're to blame, and it's just another reason to punish them once again. Yeah. So there's that dynamic. Then there's also this important thing to understand about Russia, or the current Russian regime. There's a book about currently authoritarian regimes. It's called Spin Dictators, and one of the authors is a Russian emigre politician, Sergei Guriev, and they're arguing that a lot of the authoritarian dictatorships today, they're based not only on force and even not so much on force as on propaganda. So they make themselves seem strong. Yeah. And for Russia to admit that they basically had to give away Karabakh to Azerbaijan would mean that they're weak. So the current Russian regime cannot allow that. So they came up with this whole narrative that they didn't sell out Armenia, or they were not weak, but Armenia made some mistakes. So that's why we punished Armenia by giving Karabakh to Azerbaijan. And this narrative seems quite plausible, but it ignores the fact that Russia has been weakening, and its positions in the South Caucasus have been weakening for years. And especially after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia simply did not have enough resources. And of course, Turkey and Azerbaijan are much more important for Russia. So they pretend that everything is okay in their relation with Turkey and Azerbaijan. So they have to find a scapegoat. And obviously the scapegoat is Armenia. So whatever Armenia did, I'm sure they would come up with an explanation that how Armenia is to blame for that. And if we go back to 2018 and subsequent years, I think the main mistake of Armenian government was not that they somehow were too independent. I would say the other way around. They took too seriously this idea that Russia is our ally. And I was also part of the team from 2019 to 2021, and I remember that this was basically what the majority of people in Armenian political elite were thinking, that okay, we have certain issues with Russia. They are not very enthusiastic about democracy and anti-corruption, but they're our ally. They have geopolitical interest in supporting us, and whatever happens, they won't just leave us alone, all alone and sell us out. So I think that was the main mistake.
So we should have moved faster, you think?
Well, of course, in hindsight, it's easy to say, but I can imagine in a situation if in 2018, when the revolution had just happened and there was a huge support both inside Armenia and outside of Armenia, maybe that was the time when Armenia could have tried to break this dependence, or at least loosen it a little bit. And also that was a time when probably, again, in hindsight, you could say that maybe it was a good time to try to start a dialogue with Turkey, which would probably at least make Turkey less interested in, supporting Azerbaijan to that extent. Of course, it's easy to say it now. At that time, things seemed very different, and Russia was very different then. Yeah. I mean, if we knew that Russia was going to invade Ukraine in 4 years, then maybe. But even in 2018, Russia seemed to be a, somewhat weird, but still a member of international community. There was a football world championship in Russia, so a lot of things were not so obvious as they are now.
Yeah, let's talk about Turkey a little bit. Look, let's just be honest here. I'm a proponent that we should be talking to the Turks. I think we've spent 30 years angry and not talking out of principle. I'm a descendant of genocide survivors. I'm not a fan of the Turkish state. It's a fascist country. There's no doubt. I mean, just by an objective assessment, it's a fascist country. It needs to be. Otherwise, it can't hold itself together. But if we don't talk to them, look at what happened. Whether we like it or not, there's Turkish products everywhere in this country. They're already being bought. Might as well get them cheaper if we trade. Now, the flip side to that is the danger of Georgianization, right? Is that you have entire industries and sectors. You'd be switching one genocidal hegemon for another, essentially. We also did this goodwill gesture where we sent them, tons of aid right after the earthquake. Everyone was saying, the Karabakh conflict was over. This was in 2020 when it was supposedly over. That the door was open for normalization. It didn't happen. Then they literally ethnically cleansed Karabakh, and now the Turks are saying, "Oh, one more thing, right? Be a team player. Give us the corridor, then we can normalize." So they keep moving the goalpost for normalization, having neighborly relations. What's your assessment on this? Should we still be pursuing this path? Does it make sense for us to do so? What do you think we should be doing when it comes to the Turks to neutralize their existential threat to us?
Well, I'm afraid at the moment we don't really have an alternative. There's not really much we can do. We have to say that we are ready to normalize relations. We have to say that we need peace. And it's true. I mean, it's not that we're lying. We really need peace. We really need normal relations. Obviously, there are some red lines which won't be crossed, but I don't think the problem is in Turkey per se right now. Of course, Turkey is a genocidal state. Turkey is it's another neo-colonial empire. Just look at what's happening with the Kurds and now the Turkish
Libya,
aggression.
Syria, Cyprus, Greece, Iraq.
So, but they're our neighbors, and we have to survive somehow. And unfortunately, even if we modernize our security sector, our army, etc., we will still be infinitely weaker than Turkey militarily. Yeah. So obviously we have to make the price of any aggression against Armenia very high, so that would deter them. But also we have to talk to them.
Yeah.
And in this sense, I don't think Turkey is as difficult as Azerbaijan, because Turkey is an empire. So that's both good and bad. It's bad because it's an aggressive state which seeks to, create new spheres of influence. But also it's good because an empire is, we are not top priority for them, whether in a good sense or a bad sense. For Azerbaijan, Armenia is number one enemy, and at least the current regime of Aliyev, that's their whole ideology. But with Turkey, they have a lot of interests. One day they want to become a member of European Union, another day they want to defend Palestine, another day they have some issues with Greece. So Armenia is not number one enemy, it's not top priority. Actually, majority of people in Turkey have very little information about Armenia. A lot of them have no idea where Armenia is. I talked to some Istanbul Armenians who said that their neighbors were not really sure what Armenian means, and in the end they said, so you're from Azerbaijan, it's the same thing, right? Armenia and Azerbaijan. So this is how little people, common people in Turkey, know about Armenia. So of course the Turkish elite is very nationalist. Of course Erdogan is a neo-imperialist, but also in Turkey is a big country. There are minorities, there are ethnic minorities, religious minorities, there are liberal people, there are leftist people. So you can work with Turkey, and we have to do it. And so until recently, basically our position was, if we basically pretend that Turkey doesn't exist, then we'll be fine.
Can't hurt us. Yeah.
That's not a very constructive position. So I think we have to talk to Turkey, even though we understand that in this situation, Turkey is not very, there's not much reason for Turkey to open the borders or normalize the relations. I mean, of course, it would be the rational thing to do, but it contradicts their nationalist agenda. So probably while Erdogan is still in power, we can't expect really very big achievements in this respect.
Let's switch gears back home a little bit. I wanted to ask you, there's all this hubbub about the Prime Minister's speech about lowering the bar for the status of Karabakh and recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. And there's a lot of blame towards the ruling regime. Look, personally, I think there's a lot of stuff to blame them for, which I can easily spend a couple hours on this podcast talking about. I have very serious gripes with this. But those two I'm not convinced of. The lowering the bar stuff, they've been telling us for 30 years. You're not going to get it. Get over it. Find another way to make it work. If you look at the U.S. recently declassified their documents on the negotiations in 94 to 95. And how essentially it was Kocharyan who hijacked the deal they were offering us, we would froth at the mouth for it today. We would be crying tears of joy what they were offering us. Like if you look at some of the stuff that was being discussed back then, it's nothing new. That we were never going to get what we wanted, or at least not at the, if at least we knew we weren't going to get it diplomatically, we should have been making every possible effort to militarize, strengthen, and so on. We didn't do it. That's the reality. I hate to say it, but that's the reality. We have the cards that were dealt, and we have to find a way to use them. The territorial integrity part, the war for Artsakh was never a war of conquest. People keep saying, well, why didn't Armenia recognize Artsakh? Because we're not invading Artsakh. Artsakh is a fight for independence. So that's my take on it, but I'm really not an expert. So I want to know, in your opinion, like what's everyone so upset about, and is there truth to this? Did this leave Artsakhtsis vulnerable to the aggression, the ethnic cleansing that we saw last month by doing these two specific things, recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and lowering the bar for their independence?
Well, I think if we say that this ethnic cleansing happened because Armenia recognized territorial integrity and so on, it's actually the other way around. After 2020, and especially after Russian invasion of Ukraine, it became obvious that there's a very serious threat of ethnic cleansing, that Azerbaijan wants to get rid of the Russian peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, and of the Armenian population. And there's not much that can stop them. And there was an international consensus from the 90s that Azerbaijan's territorial integrity should be respected, that Artsakh, unfortunately, according to international community, is a part of Azerbaijan. Maybe it was possible to change that consensus in the 90s, but it wasn't possible to change that in 2016 or 18 or 20 or 22. So, and basically Armenia's position was never very clear. So if you look at the internal discourse, Armenian government, political elites, they were always saying that, yes, we're for independence, and a lot of people in Armenia believe that even the 7 regions should never be surrendered. This is part of Artsakh now. But if you look at what Armenia was saying and doing on the international scene, it was very different. Armenia was negotiating documents like the Madrid Principles, etc., which were based on the recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, which were based on surrendering the 7 regions and so on. So,
sorry just to cut you off, but I do want to, just to be fair, the PM also did say some stupid things. He did go and say Artsakh Hayastan всё, right? Like, we also, like, the current administration does have a part to play in that as well. I just want to point that out so it doesn't seem like we're justifying their failures.
Of course, now when we look back, that was a big mistake. But I don't think it's wrong to say that the war happened because of that. The mistake was that it gave Azerbaijan kind of opportunities, Azerbaijani propaganda, some opportunities to justify the war, but the war was going to happen anyway.
The war was coming since 96. We were living on credit and borrowed time. We paid the price in 2020 and last month. Anyone could have seen this. Anyway.
And after basically, when in 2020 the war ended and the Russian so-called peacekeepers went there, everybody thought that they were going to stay there for years and maybe decades. But then the war in Ukraine started, and it became obvious to anyone who was watching close enough that Russia's resources won't be enough, that sooner or later Russia will have to leave and it will try to sell this to Azerbaijan. So in this situation, what would be the optimal way for Armenia and Artsakh to behave? To understand that, okay, this is the situation, to understand that we are not going to have an opportunity for independence of Artsakh, and at least to try to negotiate a solution which would allow Armenians to stay in their homes in Artsakh, internationally recognized as Azerbaijan, but with some guarantees of securities, with preferably not Russian peacekeepers, but obviously it was difficult to imagine, but at least to have a situation in which Armenians will have an opportunity to stay in Azerbaijan. Maybe there would be negotiations which last for years and until something changes. The point was to find some kind of a model which allows Armenians to stay there without fearing for their safety. And that was the point. And another reason,
even recognizing stating we're well, to be fair, what his statement was that we're prepared to recognize.
Yes, that was why this whole conversation started, and also another point was to safeguard the borders of Armenia, because in especially September 2022, there was a big attack of Azerbaijan on Armenia's internationally recognized territory, and CSTO did nothing, Russia did nothing, so the only force able to stop this was basically the West, or US more specifically.
It was Blinken who picked up the phone.
Yes, but also there was a price to it. So basically Azerbaijan was saying, okay, we'll stop the offensive, but we need mutual territorial recognition. And there was no way Armenia could refuse that, because it was also in line with the international consensus.
So that's interesting. So that was their condition for stopping the fighting a year ago.
Well, it's not that I have some information. I assume, just looking at what happened, it seems that this was the condition, because a few weeks after that, Prague happened, and that's what was announced in Prague. And after that, there were no major attacks on Armenia's sovereign territory.
The peacekeeper part that you mentioned is interesting, because a couple of days ago, Putin and Aliyev announced that the peacekeepers will stay until 2025 to safeguard the 10 or so Artsaksis who are still there. What's going on? Like, how are they still there? What kind of clownery is this?
Well, it's interesting. I have a cousin who has nothing to do with politics, and he's in the construction business, but we talked to him a lot about different stuff. And even back in 2021, I think he said this, I won't be surprised if Russians receive a military base in Azerbaijan, but Armenians are ethnically cleansed. Because maybe, I'm not saying this is what will happen, but I think that's an option for Russia. Like, maybe Russia is trying to kind of push this agenda that, okay, we let you get Karabakh back. Now you give us a military base. Of course, Azerbaijan is not very enthusiastic about this perspective, and of course they will try to get rid of Russians when they are able, but also it's I think the thinking in Azerbaijan is that Russia is getting weaker and weaker, and one day it will just fall apart, so why antagonize it now? Let them stay for another year anyway. Probably in this 1 year so many things will happen that they will have to move out. But it's hard to predict what will happen. Maybe in a couple of months they will move, because obviously I don't think this was the Russian plan. I think the Russians expected that at least a few thousand, maybe 10, maybe 20,000 Armenians would stay in Artsakh, which would justify their presence. And obviously that's not the case now. So I think eventually they will have to move out, but Azerbaijan is probably not very, not insisting that it has to happen just today or tomorrow.
Do you think that's the same thinking here? That eventually we're going to move towards closing the Gyumri base? Listen, I'm tired of giving my passport to a FSB blonde guy at the airport who greets me in Russian when I come to my homeland. So that's my personal feelings. But more generally speaking, do you think that Armen Grigoryan has publicly stated this, right? That the end goal would be for Armenia to protect its own borders. And that to me was a pretty clear intention, signaling of this government's geopolitical intentions in the coming couple of years. Do you think this is the thinking as well? We're kind of waiting them out.
Well, I think that's one of the probable scenarios. And if you look back at how the Soviet Union collapsed, so there were republics, like Soviet republics, which were actively struggling for their independence, like Armenia, Georgia, the Baltic countries, and then there were countries like Turkmenistan, for example, which were basically just they just didn't. There were no major movements there. Nothing was happening, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and they received their independence. So. Unfortunately for Armenia, this second option is not really working because of everything that's happening around us. But also, I think there is a understanding that maybe we shouldn't hurry too much, because certain things will happen anyway as Russia is getting weaker. Of course, in this sense, Armenia and Azerbaijan are in different situations, because Azerbaijan has sort of a big brother, Turkey, and Armenia, unfortunately, doesn't have an ally like that. Of course, we are trying to now create a new relationship with EU, with France, with India. So, but obviously that's not the same kind of relationship that Turkey and Azerbaijan have. So in
we
this sense,
can at some point. I don't see the. I'm sorry to cut you off, but one interesting analogy that was given to me by a source of mine was that in the same way that the Greeks have, other than NATO, they have an actual bilateral mutual defense treaty with France against Turkey, a NATO ally, right? And France sends them weaponry for affordable rates, almost very similar to what we have with Russia, except this is probably something real other than the toilet paper that we have with Russia. And from what I've understood is that the intention is to form something similar. I mean, it might take a decade, it might take two, but maybe at some point the door will open to have that kind of relationship with a world power.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope it will happen. And also I think that for the West, they are looking for new partners in this region. And by this region, I mean a larger region, including also the Middle East, because obviously the partnership with Israel has become, quite questionable. And, it's a big question whether it serves their interests or it actually doesn't. So in this sense, I think it would make sense for the West to invest in Armenia as a new security partner, as an ally, the way they're doing with Greece. So I think that's a good analogy. But what I mean is, when you look at Turkey and Azerbaijan, it's basically, whoever is in government, whatever the policies are, they see each other as brothers. They see each other as the same nation or the same people or the same culture. So, the only analogy to that would be if somehow the Kilikia and Armenia survived. Of course, this Armenia and Kilikia and Armenia would have a very close relationship no matter who's in government. So unfortunately, we don't have an ally like that. We don't have an ally with whom our alliance is based on culture, religion, ethnicity, shared culture, and so on. So we have to navigate this. We have to find allies. We have to create these alliances. Azerbaijan already has this. So we have to take this account. So if we're talking about military, then we have to be several times stronger than they are, which today it's hard to imagine. But also, given the technological progress, maybe Armenian IT people will find a way to, find new technologies of cyber warfare, for example, which will make Armenia undefeatable in the future.
Look at even their economy. I mean, I'm Armenia aside, I'm not particularly hopeful for Azerbaijan as a country that has a particularly bright future. Anyways, it's you saw this article recently, right? That the internal plan was to the best word is in Armenian, right? Hamozel, to kind of ingratiate the Artsakhtsis left would be to kind of integrate them into Azerbaijan's economy, but then they realized that the average Artsakhtsi was making more money than the average Azeri, right? I'm not particularly. My worry is really their partnership with Turkey. It's Azerbaijan itself. If it were one-on-one and we had the will to reform, we can definitely stand this chance.
Yeah, I agree. I don't share, a lot of people are saying now, oh, look at Azerbaijan, how they played their cards well and, they've created an effective system and so on. I don't think so. No. I think they were basically lucky and they used our mistakes and they positioned themselves well they went with the flow. So Armenia in the last few decades, it was kind of trying to go against the trends, against the tide, against the global process, and Azerbaijan managed to get itself in the right direction, in the right place, and to use this. But I think the future of Azerbaijan is not particularly bright. If you look at these photos of Aliyev alone in the empty cities, I mean, if somebody who's neither Armenian nor Azerbaijani looks at them, I think the only reaction is laughing or pitying this country that has this kind of a dictator. So I don't think Azerbaijan has a very bright future. Unfortunately, it's not good for us either. So we have a country which is next to us, which hates us, where people live worse than in our country, and they hate us.
They need an outlet.
And they have a lot of weapons, and their military is stronger than ours. So that's a very dangerous situation that we have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I appreciate you hopping on. This was really an interesting discussion. I think we can definitely have you on for another one. There's some more topics I'd like to explore with you, but for now, thank you, Mikayel.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there's so many things that we could talk about, but hopefully next time.
Yeah. And thanks again for watching. Thanks for joining us at CivilNet.